I came home from my Thursday water aerobics class and found my daughter-in-law standing in my bedroom with a measuring tape stretched across the far wall, writing numbers down in a small notebook. She did not even turn around when I walked in. She said, "You won't need this much space much longer." I did not say a word. I walked to my dresser, opened the bottom drawer, and lifted out a folded document I had kept there for 11 years. I laid it flat on the bed beside her measuring tape and said, "Try me. Before I tell you what happened over the next 6 weeks, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Comment your city. I read every single one, and if you have ever had someone try to measure you out of your own life, I want you to know this story is for you. My name is Carol Ann Whitfield. No relation to a family from another story some of you may have watched, just a coincidence of a common last name here in Ohio. I am 66 years old, a retired elementary school librarian, and I have lived in the same four-bedroom house on Larchmont Drive outside Dayton for 34 years. My husband Gerald and I bought this house when our son Mark was 6 years old, back when the neighborhood was still half farmland, and the mortgage payment felt enormous on a librarian's salary and a machinist's wages combined. Gerald passed away 8 years ago from a heart attack in the garage, working on a lawnmower that never did get fixed. I kept the house exactly as it was, mostly, though I did finally get someone else to fix that lawnmower. Mark is 37 now. He works in logistics management for a shipping company in Columbus, a solid, steady job that keeps him traveling more than either of us would like. He married Renee 6 years ago. She is a marketing coordinator, sharp, articulate, the kind of person who can walk into a room and immediately understand who holds the influence in it. I want to be fair to her in this story because I have tried very hard to be fair to her in my own head for 6 years, so I will tell you plainly, she is not a cruel person in the ordinary sense. She has never raised her voice at me. She has never said a single insulting word to my face, not until the day I'm about to describe. What she has instead is a particular talent for rearranging reality so slowly and so reasonably that by the time you notice what has shifted, it has already become the new normal, and objecting to it makes you look like the unreasonable one. 3 years ago, Mark and Renee moved in with me. It happened the way these things often happen, not as one dramatic request, but as a series of small, sensible-sounding steps. Renee's job had relocated its main office, cutting her commute times significantly if she lived closer to Dayton. Mark's travel schedule made it hard for them to keep up two households efficiently. They were saving for a house of their own, they said, and staying with me for a year or two would let them put away a real down payment instead of throwing money at rent. I said yes, immediately, and I want to be honest with you. I was not entirely selfless in saying yes. Since Gerald died, this house has often felt too large and too quiet for one person, and the idea of my son's laughter in the kitchen again, even temporarily, felt like a gift rather than an imposition. The first year was genuinely good. Renee helped me reorganize the kitchen pantry in a way that actually made sense for the first time in 3 decades. She cooked dinner most Sunday evenings, real meals, not takeout, and she always made enough for 3. Mark fixed the fence along the back property line that had been leaning since a storm 4 years earlier. I told myself, more than once, that this arrangement was working exactly as it should, family helping family, exactly the way Gerald and I always believed a family should function. The shift began so gradually that I genuinely cannot point to a single day it started. Sometime in the second year, Renee began referring to certain rooms differently. The guest room down the hall, which I had always simply called the guest room, became her office. That was fine, practically speaking, since she did need somewhere quiet to take work calls, and I told her so myself. But then the sunroom off the kitchen, which had been Gerald's favorite spot to read the newspaper every morning of our marriage, became, in Renee's language, our reading nook, spoken as though it had always belonged to her and Mark, rather than to the two of us who built this house. I noticed these small linguistic shifts, and I let them go, because objecting to word choices felt petty, felt like the kind of thing that would make me sound like an old woman, clinging too tightly to furniture and floor plans, instead of focusing on what actually mattered, which was having my son nearby. By the third year, the down payment savings Mark had originally described had, according to occasional comments Renee made at dinner, grown more complicated. There was talk of Renee's student loans needing to be paid off first before they could responsibly take on a mortgage. There was talk of waiting for interest rates to improve. There was, eventually, very little talk at all about them leaving, and I noticed that the conversations about their future house had quietly stopped being conversations about a house they would move into and started sounding, instead, like conversations about improvements to this one. As though the timeline for leaving had dissolved entirely into a permanent arrangement nobody had actually agreed to out loud. There were other small moments during that third year that I did not fully register as part of a pattern until much later, looking back with the clarity that only comes after the fact. Renee began redecorating the downstairs hallway without asking, replacing photographs Gerald and I had chosen together with framed prints she preferred, storing my originals in a box in the basement, rather than simply asking whether I wanted them elsewhere. She reorganized the linen closet according to her own system, and when I mentioned, gently, that I had trouble finding the extra pillowcases afterward, she suggested, not unkindly, but not quite kindly either, that perhaps the old system had simply been outdated and I would adjust. She began hosting her book club at the house on the second Tuesday of every month, which I did not mind in principle, except that she never once asked whether the date or the timing worked for me, simply informed me the week before that 8 women would be arriving Tuesday evening and that the living room would need to be available. Individually, none of these moments felt significant enough to raise as a grievance. Collectively, I understand now, they formed the exact pattern that made the bedroom incident possible in the first place. Renee had learned, gradually, and without any single dramatic test, that I would accommodate almost any shift in how the house was used, described, or claimed, provided it was framed reasonably and delivered without confrontation. By the time she stood in my bedroom with a measuring tape, she was not making some enormous, unprecedented leap. She was simply extending a pattern that had gone unchallenged for 2 full years, one small redefinition at a time. I want to pause here and tell you something about myself, something I think matters for understanding why I let this go on as long as I did. I spent 31 years as an elementary school librarian, and if there is one thing that job teaches you, it is patience with process. Children do not learn to read in a single dramatic moment. They learn slowly, through repetition, through small corrections gently offered again and again, until the pattern finally clicks. I think, without fully realizing it, I had started applying that same patience to my daughter-in-law, believing that if I simply continued being generous and reasonable, eventually the natural conclusion of respect and gratitude would click into place on its own. I was wrong about that, though it took me longer than I would like to admit to understand why. Renee was not a child slowly learning a skill. She was an adult who had figured out correctly that I would absorb almost any small overreach rather than create conflict in my own home. The specific event that finally cracked this open happened on a Thursday in late October. I take a water aerobics class at the Community Recreation Centre every Tuesday and Thursday morning, a habit that has done more for my knees and my mood over the past 4 years than anything else I have tried. That particular Thursday, class ended early because of a scheduling issue with the pool maintenance crew, so I arrived home nearly 40 minutes before my usual time. I walked in through the side door off the kitchen, the way I always do, and I heard voices upstairs before I even reached the staircase. One of them was Renee. The other, unmistakably, was her mother, Diane Sorrell, a woman I have met perhaps 8 times over 6 years, always pleasant enough in the brief, surface way that people are pleasant when they do not particularly intend to know you any better than they already do. I climbed the stairs, and what I found in my own bedroom, the room Gerald and I shared for 26 years, the room where I still sleep every night under the same quilt his mother made us as a wedding gift, was my daughter-in-law standing at the far wall with a fabric measuring tape stretched from corner to corner, calling out numbers while her mother wrote them into a small spiral notebook propped against the dresser. I stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them noticed me. Renee's mother saw me first, and something in her face shifted. A flicker of the kind of caught expression you rarely see on an adult, quickly smoothed back into pleasant neutrality. Renee turned around a beat later. And here is the part I want you to understand clearly. She did not look embarrassed at all. She looked, if anything, mildly inconvenienced that I had come home early enough to interrupt whatever timeline she had planned around my absence. She said it exactly the way I described at the start of this story. "You won't need this much space much longer." She said it lightly, almost cheerfully, the way you might mention a minor scheduling change, not the way you announce that you intend to remove someone from their own bedroom. Her mother, to her credit, or perhaps simply out of self-preservation, said nothing at all, just stood there with the notebook, waiting to see how this would unfold. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you watching are imagining a dramatic confrontation with shouting, and that is simply not who I am, and it would not have served me even if it were. I walked past both of them to my dresser, the same dresser Gerald and I bought second-hand from a moving sale 41 years ago, and I opened the bottom drawer, the one that sticks slightly in humid weather and always has. Inside, beneath a stack of old photo albums, was a folder I had kept there for 11 years, since the year Gerald and I finished paying off the mortgage entirely and had the deed recorded free and clear in both our names, and later, after his death, transferred fully into mine alone through the estate process. I lifted it out, unfolded the top page, and laid it flat on the bed, directly beside Renee's measuring tape. "Try me," I said. I will admit, there was a certain satisfaction in watching the colour drain slightly from Renee's face as she read the document upside down from where she stood, recognizing well enough what a property deed looks like, even without being able to read every line clearly. Her mother set the notebook down on the dresser without being asked and said something quiet about needing to check on her own errands, and left the room within about 90 seconds, which told me a great deal about how much of this plan had actually been Renee's mother's idea versus Renee's own initiative. Renee tried, briefly, to reframe what I had just walked in on. She said she and her mother had simply been talking, hypothetically, about what the room might look like someday, that nothing had been decided, that I was overreacting to a private conversation I had misunderstood. I told her I did not think a measuring tape and a spiral notebook full of dimensions represented a hypothetical conversation, and I told her, calmly, that I would like some time alone in my own bedroom, in my own house, to think clearly about what I had just seen. She left. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after that, looking at the deed, thinking about Gerald, thinking about the 26 years we slept in that room together, and the 8 years I had slept in it alone since, and thinking about how casually, how comfortably, my son's wife had apparently begun planning to relocate her own mother into that exact space, presumably assuming I would either not notice the shift happening around me or would be too conflict-averse to object once it was already underway. I did not confront Mark that evening. He was traveling for work, somewhere in Indiana overseeing a distribution center transition. And I have found across many years of difficult family moments that important conversations conducted over the phone rarely go as well as the ones you can have face to face, where tone and expression carry information that words alone cannot. Instead, I called my attorney the next morning, a man named Frank Delacroix, who has handled my estate matters since shortly after Gerald passed. I told him what I had witnessed, and I asked him a very specific question. I wanted to understand exactly what my legal position was as the sole owner of this property regarding the presence of adult children and their spouses living in my home without any formal lease or written agreement of any kind. Frank's answer was clarifying in a way I appreciated, because Mark and Renee had never signed any lease, never paid rent, and had no legal tenancy agreement of any kind. What existed between us was what Ohio law refers to as a license to occupy, essentially permission I had granted informally and could, with appropriate notice, revoke entirely at my discretion. He recommended, given the circumstances, that if I wanted to establish clear boundaries going forward, I had every legal right to do so, and he offered to draft a formal notice outlining reasonable terms, should I decide that was the direction I wanted to take. I did not immediately decide to remove my own son from my home. I want to be honest about that, because I know how this might sound if I skip that part. Whatever frustration I felt toward Renee, Mark is still my son, and the idea of formally evicting him from the house he grew up in was not a decision I arrived at lightly or quickly. What I decided, instead, was that the arrangement needed to change fundamentally from an open-ended, undefined situation that Renee had clearly begun treating as permanent and expandable into something with actual structure, actual terms, and actual boundaries that could not be quietly measured around while I was out at water aerobics. Mark returned from his trip that Sunday. I asked him to sit down with me at the kitchen table that evening, once Renee had gone upstairs, and I told him plainly what had happened Thursday. I watched his face as I described it, and I want to tell you, his reaction told me something important. He was not entirely surprised. There was a flicker of recognition in his expression, the look of a man who has been quietly aware of a slow drift happening in his own household and had chosen, for whatever reason, comfort or conflict avoidance or simple distraction from his own work travel, not to address it directly himself. He tried at first to explain it the way Renee had, as an innocent, hypothetical conversation blown out of proportion. I told him I understood he wanted to believe that, and that I loved him for wanting to see the best in his wife, but that a measuring tape and a notebook of specific dimensions did not constitute an innocent hypothetical, and that regardless of how it started, I needed him to understand something clearly. This house belongs to me. Not to us in some vague, sentimental sense, but to me, specifically, legally, entirely, and I was no longer willing to have that fact treated as a minor detail to be worked around while decisions were made without my knowledge or consent. I laid out the terms Frank and I had discussed. If Mark and Renee wanted to continue living in the house, we would put a formal, written agreement in place, a fair monthly contribution toward utilities and groceries, a clear and mutually agreed upon timeline for their eventual move into a home of their own, and an explicit, written understanding that no changes to the household, and certainly no plans involving additional occupants, would be made without a direct conversation with me first. If that structure was not something they were willing to accept, I told him gently but clearly, I needed them to begin making arrangements to find their own place within the next 90 days. Mark was quiet for a long time after I finished. Eventually, he asked me the question I imagine many of you have wondered yourselves in similar situations. He asked whether this was really about the bedroom, or whether it was about something larger, some accumulated resentment I had been carrying for longer than I had let on. I told him honestly, it was both. The bedroom was simply the moment the pattern became impossible to ignore any longer, but the pattern itself, the slow renaming of rooms, the quietly dissolving timeline for moving out, the casual assumption that my space could be redistributed according to someone else's convenience. That pattern had been building for well over a year, and I had simply chosen, mistakenly I now believed, to keep absorbing it rather than naming it out loud. The conversation with Renee, when it finally happened 2 days later, was considerably more difficult. She was defensive in a way I had genuinely never seen from her before, and at one point accused me of humiliating her in front of her own mother by, in her words, waving legal paperwork around like a threat. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I had not waved anything. I had simply shown her a fact she needed in order to understand the actual situation she was standing inside of, and that if seeing a deed felt like a threat, perhaps that said more about what she had assumed she was entitled to than about anything I had done wrong. She tried a different approach after that, one I found more revealing than her initial defensiveness. She told me that her mother, Diane, was going through a difficult period, that her father's declining health made the family home increasingly hard for Diane to manage alone, and that she had simply been trying, in her own way, to plan ahead for a problem that was coming whether any of us liked it or not. I told her I understood that concern, genuinely, and that if she had come to me directly, as a daughter-in-law speaking honestly to a mother-in-law about a real family need, we could have had an entirely different conversation, one about options, about whether there was a way to help her mother that did not involve quietly measuring me out of my own bedroom without a word of warning. What troubled me, I told her, was not the underlying concern for her mother. It was the method, the assumption that the solution to that concern could simply be built around me rather than discussed with me. She and Mark discussed the terms privately over the following week. I stayed out of that conversation deliberately because I believed, and still believe, that decisions inside a marriage need room to be made by the two people actually in it, without a mother hovering over every exchange. What came back to me, eventually, was an agreement to the structure Frank and I had proposed, with one modification Renee specifically requested: a slightly longer timeline of 120 days instead of 90, to give her enough runway to coordinate with her employer about a potential relocation assistance program tied to housing costs, something I had not known existed and was, honestly, glad to hear about. Diane Sorrell, Renee's mother, never mentioned the incident to me directly, not that day, and not in the months since. I have seen her exactly twice since, both times at family gatherings, where the conversation stayed carefully, deliberately shallow, the kind of pleasant surface interaction that exists specifically to avoid acknowledging something both people know happened. I have made my peace with that. Not every relationship needs a dramatic reconciliation to reach a stable, functional resolution. Mark and Renee moved into a rental townhouse across town almost exactly 4 months after that Thursday afternoon, well within the extended timeline we had agreed upon. I helped them move, the way any mother would, carrying boxes of kitchen items and standing in an unfamiliar living room, while Mark argued cheerfully with Renee about where the couch should go. A small, ordinary domestic argument that felt, oddly, like a relief to witness, because it meant they were finally building something of their own, in their own space, rather than quietly reshaping something of mine. Things between Renee and me have not returned to exactly what they were during that first good year, and I have made peace with that too. We are polite. We are, I think, genuinely working towards something warmer over time, slowly, the way most real repair actually happens, not through one dramatic apology, but through a series of small, ordinary interactions that gradually rebuild trust, one dinner, one holiday, one uneventful visit at a time. Last month, she called to ask my advice about a recipe for the dish Gerald used to love, the one with the rosemary and the roasted vegetables. And I found myself glad, genuinely glad, that she remembered I knew it, and glad that she called. I have also thought a great deal, in the months since, about Diane Sorrell's declining health situation, the concern Renee raised that day as the reasoning behind the measuring tape. I reached out to Renee directly a few weeks after the move and asked, honestly, whether her parents had found a workable solution for her father's care. She seemed surprised that I asked, and told me they had looked into an assisted living arrangement closer to Renee's sister in Cincinnati, something that seemed, from what she described, considerably more appropriate to her father's actual medical needs than a bedroom in my house ever would have been. I offered to help her research a few of the financial assistance programs I remembered from my years working alongside school social workers, a connection I do not think either of us expected to find useful, and it became, oddly, one of the first genuinely collaborative conversations we had shared in over a year. Mark and I have talked since, more than once, about what he wishes he had done differently during those 2 years of slow drift. He told me, on one of those Sunday calls, that he thinks he avoided noticing the pattern because acknowledging it would have meant taking a side, choosing between his wife and his mother in a way he desperately did not want to do. I told him that was, in its own way, the most honest thing he had said to me throughout the entire situation, and that I hoped, going forward, he understood that naming a problem clearly and early is rarely the same thing as choosing sides. Sometimes it is simply the only way to protect everyone involved from a much larger conflict down the road. I sleep in that bedroom every night still, under Gerald's mother's quilt, in the house we built our life inside together. Nobody has measured that wall since. Some evenings, sitting in that room with the lamp on and a book open in my lap, I think about how close I came to letting the whole thing slide, to telling myself once again that objecting would make me seem petty, that gratitude for having Mark nearby should outweigh any discomfort about the details. I am glad now that a scheduling change at the pool that Thursday sent me home 40 minutes early, because it meant I saw the truth of the situation with my own eyes instead of hearing about it secondhand, softened and rearranged into something easier to dismiss. Nobody has measured that wall since. If there is one thing I would want another woman watching this tonight to take from my story, it is simply this. Kindness inside your own home does not require you to disappear from it. You are allowed to open a family up, to let people in fully and generously, and still hold, clearly and without apology, the line of what is actually yours. A deed in a drawer is not a weapon. It is simply the truth, waiting quietly for the moment someone forgets whose house they are standing in. I did not need to raise my voice that Thursday, and I did not need to raise it in any of the conversations that followed. I only needed to be willing, finally, to say the truth out loud, instead of quietly absorbing it one more time. If this story reminded you of your own home, your own family, your own quiet moment of realizing a boundary had been slowly erased without your permission, tell me about it in the comments below. And if you believe every person deserves to feel secure inside the walls they built or inherited, please like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and I will see you in the next one.